Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-hosts Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Jason Hill, Professor of Philosophy at DePaul University and author of the new book, What Do White Americans Owe Black People? Racial Justice in the Age of Post-Oppression. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, I have definitely been looking forward to this interview. We talk a lot about what's going on, and you have an interesting take. I think we both do, so we always exchange some ideas. And you told me this book was coming up, was kind enough to send me a copy, and I started to read it. And I got to admit, I stopped after I read the first chapter. You know, typically you go through the book, but I didn't. I read the first chapter again because I wasn't expecting what I got there. So you are pretty blunt and fiery in your writings normally. I know you've been on Mark Lamont Hill and people have been, upset about your articles, but this is a little different. People talk about, race and reparations and things. This is kind of the question of, should we be having that conversation and what is the full breadth of the problem that America faces? So why did you write this book? And before we get into that chapter, I want to know who your target audience was.
Well, I wrote the book primarily as a follow-up to my fourth book, which was We Have Overcome: An Immigrant's Letter to the American People, because that book was a sort of a love letter to the American people because I grew tired of the Americophobia that I thought was suffusing our culture. And I wanted to show a particular concrete material application of how the Americophobia was manifesting itself in our culture. And I think that the whole critical race theory, the reparations movement, and the cancel culture movement are prime examples of how a form of Americophobia is manifesting itself. So I wanted to write a concrete application of what was a very theoretical but accessible book, which was a love letter to the American people, explaining what was so exceptional about America in my fourth book, We Have Overcome. And also, I think that because reparations is going to become a more of a hot topic in our culture as the years advance, I wanted to take it quite seriously. And I wanted to question, this notion of what would be presupposed by taking reparations seriously, which is that white people owe black people something. No, we all owe each other something in the large scheme of things, but do white people owe black people reparations? That is the philosophical question, and it's also a political question. It's also an ethical question. And I wanted to, as a trained ethicist and political theorist, I wanted to approach it primarily from a moral perspective. That is, what are the moral dimensions underlying the question of debt that we would have to answer in order to address the question of what do white Americans owe black people in an age that I think is post-oppressive. And I wanted to answer that question of what counts as a post-oppressive age.
So that, and who was the target audience? Just want to make sure we get that in.
Well, my target audience are dissident liberals, free-thinking liberals who have not been co-opted by the far-left kooks, conservatives who are not too extremist as to realize that reparations is something worth thinking about and taking seriously. So I would say independent, dissident liberals, people who deviate from received wisdom, from orthodox thinking, and old-fashioned conservatives in the old-fashioned sense of the term, not the sort of kooky right-wing extremists that we have out there, whom I don't think anyone can reach, nor the kooky left-wing extremists that are not reachable, but reasonable people on the right and reasonable people who are centrist liberals.
Okay, so I asked that because I was teasing up the first chapter 1, and people talk about, we're going to knock over and attack these sacred cows. But here, forget about, knocking over sacred cows. You kill the cow, field dressed it, smoked it slowly, and then served it up in the buffet style. It was like a really deep kind of shock. It was like cold water to the face, I think, for some people. So those people, I asked about the target audience because I'm trying to think as I'm reading it, how will, centrists or center left, center right people take this? So chapter 1 says how the African made himself a slave. So I would like you to give a little summary of that chapter, and then let Shamika and Will tell everybody what they thought of it. But you start off with quotes from Senegal's first president Senghor, and talk about the European man versus the African, and talk about what you were trying to say there.
Well, I wanted to show, first of all, that the whole issue of to talk about reparations, we have to go back to the beginning of the beginning, which is the African slave trade. And the first thing to remember, as Skip Gates pointed out quite reluctantly, is that 90% of the Africans sold into slavery were kidnapped by Africans themselves, enslaved, and then sold into slavery to the Europeans. So the whole slave trade was a curious melange of collusion among Arabs, Africans, and Europeans. So this idea that, there were marauding bands of Europeans just arriving on the shore of Africans and running to kidnap screaming Africans is a shibboleth that even Skip Gates himself has debunked. And the literature is out there that that's just not the case, that there was collusion among the Arabs, the Africans, and the Europeans, and that the Europeans traded Africans for tawdry cosmetic jewelry that not even peasants or proletariats in Europe would be caught wearing. This is how stupid those indigenes were, that they traded Africans for tawdry cosmetic jewelries that Europeans themselves wouldn't even wear. So if anyone owes reparations to anyone, we should, first of all, I was hinting, we should go back to sub-Saharan Africa, to those places from where the slave trade originated, Nigeria, Kenya, sub-Saharan Africa, and say, look, it's our ancestors sold us into slavery. Let's think about getting reparations from the Africans who sold us into slavery, and the Africans who actually, by their own animist philosophy, which I'll get into now, made themselves into what I call ignoble junk heap by failing to abstract themselves from nature. So when you have an animist philosophy, you, in some sense, fail to you consider it's the opposite of Judeo-Christian philosophy. You think of yourself as inseparable from nature. You're not abstractable from nature. You have not transformed yourself out of biological time. There's a cyclicality that you are in sync with in terms of nature, and you cannot make yourself into an epoch historical person. So when you fail in some sense to abstract yourself from nature by transcending it, and you view yourself as inextricably bound to nature, there's a way in which you just don't enter the historical process. And I argue that only those who are divorced from nature, that is, people who in some sense do not behave like animals, that is, what animals do is that they adapt themselves to nature. And what human beings do is that they are malleable entities who adapt nature to meet their desires and to meet their aspirations and to meet their creative capabilities. That's what separates us from animals. We don't adapt ourselves to nature. We adapt nature to meet our needs. When there's a drought, animals die or they go seeking a water hole. When there's a drought, we build dams. When there's heat, animals die from heat waves. We build air conditioning units. And when we were attacked by a bunch of primordial savages, we write a constitution, or we write a Declaration of Independence, right? So our whole manner of entering the historical process and of evolving as creatures, as human beings, is to divorce ourselves from nature, to see something nature as separate from ourselves. So I wanted to show that not all Africans, but the sub-Saharan Africans, the region from which slavery originated, were individuals who held an animist philosophy, and that this animist philosophy compromised them epistemologically, politically, and technologically, for the reasons I've pointed out. And that's in a nutshell, I mean, there is more to it because the chapter is about 45 to 50 pages long. That's the basic thrust of it. When you do not see yourself as separate from nature, when you see yourself as inextricably bound to nature, when you're not separable from the animal kingdom but a part of it, there's a way in which you cannot also devise not just the technological capabilities that you need, but you cannot devise the political vocabularies of inalienability, of inviolability, that you need to protect human dignity and human worth from the onslaughts of those who would seek to eviscerate you of your human dignity. You have no political or moral vocabulary as an inoculant to protect you. So you are left at the behest of those who see you as, in some sense, indistinguishable from water buffalo, from the minerals that they are extracting from the earth, from deer, from antelope. You're just a part of nature that needs to be exploited because you yourself have presented yourself as being just that, as a part of nature. You have not abstracted yourself from nature and made yourself into a separable entity. You've made yourself into a commodifiable entity in failing to abstract yourself from nature.
Okay, so I think the expectation here would be that I go the wheel, so I'm not. So Shamika, tell me what you thought, well, both of the first chapter, but also the premise of his approach being how you have to look at this broader if you're going to talk about reparations.
Well, of course, Charles, you know that I called you and said, so is he saying we should be grateful for being slaves? For slavery, we should be thankful. That's what I was trying to figure out. But just listening to him speak just now, it kind of makes me think about what Will always says as far as how we are just predatory. Like if you're going to make it, you have to have some type of, I guess, predator nature. And hearing him talk, it seems like that's what they were missing, in the sense that they weren't able to really be prepared for the Europeans when they came across, or for those Africans that actually sold them into slavery, that they just didn't have that mindset. That was also a question, remember, I was asking you, Charles, like, what was it about them that they had not evolved? And I guess now, Jason, since you're here, what was it about those particular Africans that they had not evolved to the point where they could actually do that, whereas other humans had?
Well, like I said, I located in terms of holding an animist philosophy, and I think the Native Americans. I've written an article recently called "Genocide, Stolen Lands, and Other Lies About America," that the Native Americans and a lot of Aboriginal cultures that we would call Aborigines, hold similar philosophies, animist philosophies. That is, when you are not separate from nature, cognitively, you are not able to devise methods that protect you from those who have. And cognitively, there is something that you fail to develop in terms of forming abstractions and forming concepts, higher level concepts and higher level abstractions that would qualify you to develop sophisticated forms of technology which are derived from exploiting the earth. But if you have a sort of sacred approach to the earth, that the earth is something that is you are a part of the earth, and that you need to get permission from the earth to even eat, that you need to get permission from the earth, that you sort of anthropomorphize nature in such a way that you cannot in any way exploit it. You cannot in any way be rapacious towards nature in the good sense of being rapacious. That is, mining it of its resources to suit your predatory needs. And I think that the use of the term predator is right. That is, humans do have a predatory instinct, and which we need for survival, going back to the beginnings of or human makeup. That is, if we don't have that predatory instinct, we would have died. We needed that predatory instinct, and it's an instinct, I think, that is built into our makeup. So I think the holding of an animist philosophy, the sense of not, and I'm speaking strictly about sub-Saharan Africans here, the sense of not, for whatever reason, adopting, or because you don't find this among the Egyptians and you don't find this among Northern Africans, who did have more interactive relations with outsiders and had competing worldviews that they were able to incorporate within their philosophic systems. It is a failure to absolve oneself of an animist philosophy, or to adopt a non-animistic philosophy, or to hold even animistic philosophy in conjunction with other competing worldviews, and to even navigate. Let's say you hold three competing worldviews: an animistic philosophy, the Egyptians, one of the Egyptian sky cults or something like that, and there's a third one, and you navigate among the triadic registers of these three different cults or different religions. That better suits you because you have a competing set of vocabularies, or you have a competing set of systems with which to defend yourself. But I think just being bound inextricably to a sort of pure animistic worldview is one that disqualifies the sub-Saharan African, the indigene, from developing higher level forms of technology and from entering the historical process, which later on I'll talk about, what I mean by that. There were historical events that everyone has a history. That is, that everyone has a series of events that compromise one's identity. But when we talk about being outside, having no history, or being outside the historical process, we're talking about something completely different.
So, Will, I'd love to hear your take.
Chapter. Obviously, the attack that I think you'll get from anyone writing philosophically on the standard left is, are you arguing for sort of metacultural or genetic inferiority here? I mean, my own take on this, and I'll re-ask this question in a second, but I don't necessarily see how what you're saying is different from saying that most human beings didn't evolve civilizationally past slavery and so on until relatively recently. So, I mean, you also, at one point during your intro, which was solid, but I mean, you used, the term was something like aboriginal savages in this conversation to describe Native American Indians, or for that matter, sort of the Hessian opponents of the Revolutionary War fighters. And if you go back through history, I mean, a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana, Songhai, Mali, these weren't world leaders, but the tech level was quite on par with much of Eastern Europe, certainly ahead of native North America, where you still have essentially a stone-using culture, a few copper ornaments. I mean, the Africans are in general iron users. So I guess the question is, how is what you're describing different from the normal state of most human groups, Native Americans, Eastern Europeans, until pretty recently? Are you saying that this is due to something unique about Black Africans, or that this in some way morally justified slavery? What's your response to these questions, which you obviously will get?
Well, nothing. It doesn't morally justify slavery. And of course, different groups epochally develop at different moments in time. But it is undeniable and an absolute, it would be an egregious lie to say that at the time that slavery originated, that the Africans who were captured were the technological equivalents of the Europeans who came. That's just not the case.
I think most people would agree that Western Europeans and this is my last comment. I want to hear your response. I don't want to interrupt, but I mean, I think everyone would agree that Western Europeans in the small number of conqueror states, because obviously there weren't warships sailing around the world from Poland or Ireland or something like this, but Western Europeans from Spain, Britain, and so on are obviously more culturally advanced than certainly the people that were sold to them by the Ashanti or the Benin or whatnot, and in most ways than the Ashanti or the Benin themselves. But I guess the question is, how would that distinguish Africans from most other people around in 1620, a Mohawk Iroquois or something like that?
It doesn't.
Okay.
Well, they're on the same level, and I do make the point that there's something unique about Judeo-Christianity that that is the nature of Judeo-Christianity and its cosmology and its cosmogony, and the way that it sort of situates man in relation to God and man in relation to nature and the earth, is what made Western European man, so to speak, superior technologically. I don't think we even have to go the route of genetics. I mean, I think that had the Africans been exposed to Judeo-Christianity and had been suffused with the sensibilities of Judeo-Christianity and had been taught a philosophic worldview that they are separate and apart from nature, that they're made in the image of this transcendental being called God, that the earth, that they're custodians of the earth in a particular way, and that they have a moral right to that land belongs in communion with all persons, but those who can sort of use their reason and their labor to this is a Lockean argument, of course, but that they can use their reason and their labor to transform the natural resources in nature into something of a independent commodity, that becomes their private property, that the African would never have become a slave and would have met the European with a kind of fierceness that would have made them fled right back to their boats. So I don't think we need to go to the road of genetics, who is genetically, because I don't believe that sub-Saharan Africans were genetically inferior. The argument that I make is that the philosophic systems that they held them back technologically and prevented them from entering into the historical process. And we actually see in Europe that there were more backward, that not all cultures in Europe developed at the same rate, that there were cultures that, or today we would call them nation states, that had been conquered and taken over by other more advanced civilizations within Europe, technologically superior civilizations within Europe, until they caught up and could sort of hold their own. So you just look at a culture like Tsarist Russia, that you wonder. You look at the technological capabilities of an agrarian people in the 17th and 18th century compared to where England really was, and it's really there's no real comparison to be made. So even within Europe, cultures developed at different rates technologically. So I'm not making the genetic argument at all, and I'm not saying that it justifies in any way slavery. I will be controversial to say that as a result of slavery, those who were outside the historical process were brought into the crucibles of the historical process. And that's just an anthropological point I'm making. It's not a justification of slavery, and it's not even saying that slavery was, thank God for slavery, or one should be grateful that Africans were enslaved. I'm saying that as a result of it being brought into the domains of Christendom, that today there's no one today who's black, who's outside, well, unless there are still tribes living within an animistic philosophy, but there's no contemporary modern day African who lives outside the historical process today. And I would say that this is controversial. I would say that this is most certainly because of one's ensconcement within a Judeo-Christian paradigm.
I have a question. So would this kind of be like the Aboriginal Australians? Like, I was watching something and I see that they still kind of live in a world, that I can't even imagine staying in. And a lot of people complain saying that you had the white man or whatever to come and take over the land. But do you think it's because also maybe they had that same type of thinking by choice, that they just want to kind of remain, one with nature and not really advance into where we actually are now?
Well, I think there's a point to be made about that. That is, I think you can look at, and every single culture that we call Aboriginal, has its own nuance and differentiations, but I think you can sort of abstract from all of them and take something in common. That is, anytime you start to fetishize and anthropomorphize nature, and you start to, in some sense, make yourself indistinguishable from it, you are going to run into intractable problems with civilizations that have not done that, that have transcended that sort of worldview and have entered into a historical process. And by historical process, I mean becoming epoch-making beings, where they transform the course of history into something radically other than what they found it to be. So the Europeans did transform history. They created empires. They created gigantic empires, as did the Ying dynasties in China, as did non-European cultures. Those are cultures within the historical process. I cannot point to one animist, and if I'm mistaken, I stand to be corrected, but I can't point to one animist civilization. So I wouldn't even say that Africans lacked a civilization, those who held an animist worldview. But I cannot point to one culture that has steadfastly held to an animist philosophic worldview and has radically transformed the nature of the universe, that has radically transformed that civilization into an epoch-making civilization, the way that we can ostensibly point, let's say, to England, we can point to Russia, we can point certainly to China, and other places. So, and that's just a danger that one has to just, unsentimentally look at and say, this seems to be the case when we study cultures that hold strong to an animistic philosophy. It's not pejoratively demeaning them. It's just sort of anthropologically recognizing that this seems to have been the case and admitting it and then sort of moving on.
Right.
One quick question there. I mean, you keep talking about this, and obviously understandable given your background in philosophy, in terms of the philosophies that different cultures have. I mean, for example, traditional West Africans were generally animists. Obviously, the British, I suppose the majority church there would be Church of England, maybe Catholicism. And so the argument seems to be the Judeo-Christian sort of ethos, the Protestant ethic, something like that helps propel civilizations forward. But wouldn't another way of looking at this simply be that those cultures that had the most access to kind of mainstream trade became the most powerful? Because, I mean, when you mention China, for example, China is an overwhelmingly, I mean, today, if anything, an atheist society, but an overwhelmingly Buddhist society with a great deal of respect for sort of traditional practices. I mean, up until 1500, 1600, I mean, you'd also have to, the Arabs, the Mohammedan Muslim Arabs were one of the great powers in the world, the Abbasid Caliphate. You had India, the Mughal Empire. In fact, the Mongols, I would say, would be an animist civilization. They prayed to their swords and to the god of the smoke in the skies and so on. So, I mean, all of these people, the Mongol Empire, Mughal Empire, were as powerful as most of the Westerners. They fought them frequently. Isn't the reason for that just that they were closer to the Mediterranean, the Midworld Sea? They were closer to the Silk Road? When I look at extreme primitivism, like Australian Aborigines, who would be well behind, say, the Mohawk or the Zulu, you're looking at people that are isolated on the smallest continent at the bottom of the world. There weren't any trade routes. I mean, my understanding is that the traditional Aboriginal number system was like 1, 2, and a whole lot, because there just weren't that many people to trade with. What's your response to that? Do you think that it is the philosophy of the modern West that made it powerful? Or is it more practical things like learning about gunpowder from the Chinese and then using it, in the wars that racked Europe in a particular era?
Well, that's a good point, because the Chinese had gunpowder for centuries and did nothing with it.
Well, that's because they were unified. I mean, unless there was a revolution against the emperor, they did use it memorably a couple times when that happened. But in Europe, Europe was kind of the crucible where many small states were fighting one another in that sort of mountain-divided heartland of what's probably the smallest continent. But I mean, I think that's why the Europeans emerged technologically sophisticated. But no one would deny that the animist Mongols or the Muslim Arabs were also an epoch-making people. I don't think using that.
Well, the Muslims and I mean, we're conflating terms here. The Muslims belong to an Abrahamic religion, which is certainly not animistic.
No, the Mongols
the
were the animist example, but the Buddhist Chinese, the animist Mongols, largely animist, the Hindu Dravins, Mongols. I mean, all of these were people that had very sophisticated, multi-class cities, written languages, and so on. Were they not?
Yes, but they were not. The Hindus are not animists.
No, I'm not saying all these people are animists. I'm saying that the specific Judeo-Christian I'd be interested in seeing, and I don't actually. I mean, I'm not a Hindu. I don't have a strong hostile reaction to this, but I'd be interested in seeing whether the Judeo-Christian tradition in particular has correlated with a higher degree of success than, say, the Buddhist path forward throughout the past.
Well, I just wonder why such a large, wonderful civilization like India could be overtaken by a really tiny island like England.
Well,
this enormous country that has this enormous multi millennia civilization, and permitted itself through its own technological inferiority to be taken over by a country that eventually amassed almost power over almost a third of the globe. A tiny island, seemingly insignificant island, took over and made inroads into China, right? The significant inroads into China. Didn't literally colonize all of China, but made significant colonial inroads into China and colonized all of India. I go back to the idea that there is something about the Judeo-Christian philosophy, and I go into this in great deal in the chapter, when one is acting under the auspices of a monotheistic God and the mandates of that God, and one operates with a kind of missionary zeal to civilize the world and to conquer the world, to bring everyone within the crucibles of a sort of Judeo-Christian Christendom, that mindset, whether one is living in a landlocked Christian nation or one is living in a nation that has access to the open seas, is very, very different than when you come from a civilization in which there are over 600 gods, as we have in the Hindu tradition, and you can manipulate those gods, and those gods serve different purposes. It begs the question: why did India permit itself to be conquered by tiny England?
Because tiny England, by that point, already had a great number of other colonies, and they had better weapons. But they had developed those better weapons fighting with civilized white and brown and quote-unquote golden societies. I mean, there are a large number of extraordinarily famous conquerors. I mean, Alexander the Great, Darius, also the Great, Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, who were not only not Christians, but as far as I can tell, didn't come from a monotheistic tradition at all, unless you're counting sort of a generic idea of the Most High there. So, I mean, it strikes me, I think the book is well written. It's a fascinating debate, but it strikes me that another variable might well be just access to the trade routes weapons come down. I mean, copper and tin in the ancient days, and then iron, the democratic metal, and then gunpowder. Because, I mean, Alexander the Great also conquered all the way to India. He wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. But he existed hundreds of years before anyone had ever heard of Jesus. Jesus was just a spark in God's eye at that time.
Right. Well, the Greeks had a completely different conception of themselves in the world. Maybe Judeo-Christianity is a necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition for conquest. I'm clearly the Muslims who are not Christians, are not Judeo-Christians, certainly have had their fair share of conquering Europe and parts of Europe and other civilizations. So it's not just that one has to be Judeo-Christian, but what I am saying is that taken to its ultimate premium, manifesting itself in its highest form, there does seem to be something about the Judeo-Christian religion and its the manner in which it suffuses certain cultures that qualify those cultures to approach conquest in a far greater rapacious manner than even Alexander the Great. I mean, Alexander the Great went as far as Persia, of course, but wasn't able to keep the empire, and in a manner that the British and the audacity of tiny Portugal. I mean, who the hell is Portugal? Look at how tiny that country is. Spain, the Netherlands, right? These small, seemingly insignificant nations. What gave them? I have to go back to something like a philosophic tradition. What gave them not just the audacity, but the strength and the temerity and the perseverance and the capability to develop weaponry and a mindset? One has to remember that it's not just, if you have the technology, but you don't have the mindset and the perseverance and the resilience and the philosophy to authorize you to systemically use those technologies in a particular kind of way, the technology will fail you eventually. I mean, right? So, yeah.
Well, let me, obviously we can go on for days here, but there's other parts of the book. That's not the end of your controversy, though. So you shift from that to, in chapter 2, you got the moral meaning of 1776. I think you're going to get additional flack for things like, describing why the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were a remarkable feat, as you call it, in civilizational advancement. But also you say the founders they had a passionate love for man and the earth. Describe what you mean by that.
Well, there's a way in which we have to really be quite unsentimental when we look at historical events. And if you take the position that Africans or any people as a people cannot be the metaphysical center of appraising anything in the world at all, or cannot be the epicenter of the universe, and you use the largest sphere of humanity, then you have a very, very different worldview. So if you're going to just use the fact that the founding fathers had slaves, which some of them did, Adams didn't on principle, a quarter of them, I think, did not own slaves, then the Constitution as it is written, the inalienability clause, the inviolability clause, the notion of man's highest moral purpose on earth really is the pursuit of his own rational happiness, I think speaks to, in some sense, a love of the human species, that some persons were excluded at the time from the domain of the ethical or the pantheon of the human community is something to be reckoned with. But that's a flaw. That's a personal flaw or shortcoming in the thinkers at the time. So one has to look at the larger universal language that frames the Declaration of Independence and that informs the Constitution, and ask the question, what would one have to think of the human species? What would one have to think about man in general in order to formulate such a document? And one would have to have a great deal of respect. One would have to have a great deal of admiration for man in general. And the further point that I make is that there were not founders, but there were citizens at that time. There were two concurrent societies running. There were two parallel societies running concurrently with each other, right? So there were people who thought that Africans should have been included in the domain of the ethical, in the pantheon of the human community. That there were Africans who should enjoy the inalienability clause. Lincoln and certainly Jefferson thought, among others, that, and I think this argument is dubious, but it is both dubious and it is worth taking seriously, that society had not progressed. This is one of the arguments that Jefferson made why he couldn't free his slaves, that if he freed them, he would be freeing them to massacre because whites weren't ready to accept blacks as their equals. The Quakers were conscientious dissenters, right? And there were abolitionists at the time of the founding of this country who were very, very angry, to say the least, that blacks were not part of this domain of the ethical, this domain, part of the pantheon of the human community, who would enjoy the inalienability clause of our founding. So I take a really sort of non-sentimental look at the founding, the 1776 founding, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and ask the question in a larger context: what would the founders have had to have felt about man qua man, the individual, to have formed this document? It's a great deal of respect, a great deal of love, a great deal of admiration for the species. That document is built on, is predicated on promoting the conditions that are conducive to flourishing, not just survival, but to flourishing, and to creating a constitutional republic in which individuals are ensconced to find conceptions of the good life for themselves, where the whole notion of the good becomes the province of the individual and not the state, where the state prioritizes the right over the good. To cede that to the individual is a marked improvement on the historical record. We're coming out of Europe, where the state, out of a sort of role society, where the state did conceive conceptions of the good life for its citizens, as we had under royal sovereignty, and from the shift of political liberalism, which we inherited from Europe, and the founding fathers sort of codified in the making of this country, where the conception of the good life, you're free to create that conception of the good life, the whole notion of freedom of conscience, and to apply that conscience materially in a way where you can conceive the good life for yourself, and the state cannot contravene on that conception of the good life, presupposes an admiration for the sensibilities of the ordinary person. Now, of course, it is tragic and unfortunate that at the time blacks were certainly left out of that conversation. But I argue that the whole notion of inalienability, inviolability, are the benchmarks out of which black freedom was constructed. Notice that Martin Luther King and the whole civil rights movement didn't create a new set of political or moral vocabularies at all. We are the legatees of 1776 in the sense that Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders called on the moral vocabularies, utilized the moral vocabularies created by slaveholder Jefferson and other founding fathers. The promise, and to say the promise was not fulfilled, but we're going to use the vocabulary and the moral terminologies and political terminologies to fulfill the delayed promise that was promised to blacks at the founding, but was not carried through. So that's what I mean, Charles, that it can't have been that radically divorced from blacks if 200 something years later, civil rights leaders could invoke the same vocabularies that were in some sense largely applicable only to whites and use it to emancipate blacks and to free blacks completely from state-sanctioned oppression.
Well, let's end on that. The whole point of this is to talk about what is owed, what is the debt. And you argue that the Civil Rights Act was kind of like the third founding after the Civil War, the original founding, and how it was the start of reparations. But then in your last chapter, you talk about how that went too far. You talk about what you call victim revolution studies and how the semi-illiterate race hustlers started to infiltrate the universities. And you talk about Black studies and how it's not a real discipline. And the really unique way you put it, in addition to the semi-literate race hustlers, because I like that and make me laugh, was that you also said that beyond the Civil Rights Act, that was a form of reparations, letting them take this pseudo intellectual drivel and use it as, and move it up the ranks as a force alongside of true science, and act like it is a full discipline, which you argue it's not, is in itself a form of reparations.
Well, be careful here. The civil rights was no gift, and we should never be grateful for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I say that that is the third founding of America. That is a full circle. That is the promise that was delivered. Blacks should never feel, thank you, massa, thank you, sir, or thank you, the man for the Civil Rights Act. We blacks in America, and all of us who live in America today, deserve the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It's not some sort of, gift. It's a discovery of the rights that all of us as human beings were endowed with by our Creator, which were ignored by the founders, largely speaking. So the 64 Civil Rights Act ended legal oppression, where blacks are brought full circle and enjoy full standing before the law. The reparative moments I talk about are affirmative action, which I strangely argued were necessary at the time. There was a time in our history where affirmative action certainly was necessary. You cannot I agree with Lyndon Johnson here, you cannot just free a people who've been in bondage and enslaved and living on a Jim Crow law for centuries, for a pretty long time, and then just let them loose. So affirmative action strategically and morally served a purpose. And in terms of the Black Studies programs, that's a form of reparations. That is saying to blacks, we recognize you as part now of the sovereign mass, where before blacks were not recognized as part of the sovereign mass. They were excluded from that privilege. So you're part of the sovereign mass. You have a sort of semblance of autonomy and sovereignty. You want to decolonize yourself from the Western mind. We're going to give you that freedom. There's a whole host of freedoms and liberties that were granted under the Black Studies programs that I don't think Shelby Steele has exhausted them, and he's the greatest writer on this topic that I know. But the sovereignty and the autonomy that blacks were given on the Black Studies programs to cultivate in their own name and in their own right programs, ways of cognitive, epistemological, metaphysical, ethical ways of approaching subjects that were consonant with their agency as black people. That was a deeply reparative moment in our culture. And it's unfortunate that the people who ran these programs were that started running these programs were semi-literate race hustlers. If only we had Du Bois and other real scholars running some of these programs in the 1960s, it would have been different. But that's beside the point. I think it was actually strategically necessary to have such programs. What I have issue with is the way in which they were run. They weren't ran as real disciplines at all. They were just power lusting individuals who wanted to infiltrate certain departments with an agenda, and we see the results today. The decolonization of courses, critical race theory, postmodernism, all the kinds of malarkey, the kind of malarkey that is suffusing our programs today. So I think those were reparative gestures that were made. And for me, the expiration date has already arisen. And this is where I am controversial in that I do think we live in a post-oppressive age, in the sense that there are still racists out there because they're psychotic, stupid people, which is what racists are. But does racism systemically suffuse all our institutions, which is what systemic racism is? Does it systemically suffuse all our institutions? Do we have an ideology of the supremacy of the white race as we once did? No. Do we have laws that are punitive of blacks solely on the basis of race? No. Are there still problems that are systemic, like our prison industry? Yes, where blacks are incarcerated for smoking crack at a far greater rate than you would find white people who inhale or whatever they do with cocaine. Those never tried it. I don't know what they do. Sometimes they ingest it in other areas of their body or inject it in certain other areas of the body. Anyway, you get the point, right? So there are still injustices, and there's still flaws that have to be remedied. But are those sufficient to classify our age as an oppressive one in which blacks are ensconced? I think not.
Well, we unfortunately will have to leave it there, but maybe there's part 2 in the works down the road. He is Jason Hill, professor of philosophy at DePaul University, and the author of What Do White Americans Owe Black People? Racial Justice in the Age of Post-Oppression. Jason, thank you for your time.
Thank you all very much. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
To say, Patriot J, I'm saving the day. Patriot J, I'm saving the day from you commies who lame. No, you can't fuck with me. I got a country to save. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and the home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.